from the world of politics.
It's time for Ukraine to reply in kind against Russian airfields, missile launch facilities, and logistics supply facilities.
To the world of business.
They want to bring inflation down. In order to bring inflation down, the economy's got to slow some, but they don't want it to slow too much.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. The United States announced strong jobs numbers for March, and President Biden gave us his take on those numbers a short time ago.
Even though we created a record number of jobs, I know that this job is not finished. We need to do more to get prices under control. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has driven up gas prices and food prices all over the world.
To take us through these numbers, we welcome now our international economics and policy correspondent, Mr. Michael McKee, in Washington today to cover these jobs numbers. So, Mike, thanks for being with us. Everybody seems to agree these are pretty strong numbers. Give us the high points.
Well, you know, David, in Washington, there's a famous saying called Miles' Law. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And if you're sitting in the Oval Office, these were great numbers because 431,000 people got jobs during the month of March, which was about what was expected. Another strong month there. And the unemployment rate dropped to 3.6%, 62.4% for the participation rate. More people looking for work and getting paid more. The average hourly earnings number went up to 5.6% annual basis. So that is the good news. The bad news for people is if you're sitting on Wall Street, because this raises the question of whether, as the president noted, we're seeing too much inflation and the Fed would have to work too hard, raise rates too much to bring that down. We had the ISM number come out a little after the jobs number, and factories reported business was a little bit slower in the month of March. We also saw that the prices paid index for the ISM number went up to 87 from the prior week, from the prior number of 75. So some inflation pressures building in the factory sector as the factory sector slows down a little bit.
Well, and just one more point on this, Mike. You showed that 5.6% increase year over year in wages. That sounds pretty good if you're a worker. At the same time, inflation is well above that. So, in fact, in practice, you're making less money, not more.
Yeah, take a look at, for those of you who are on radio, I apologize, but take a look at this chart that I brought along here that shows the Fed's dilemma here. In the past, they have always had to raise interest rates above the unemployment rate and above the rate of inflation. And you can see in 1999, you remember, we got down to 3.5% unemployment, and we saw inflation rise, but not that much. And you look all the way over on the right side of that, and you can see we're way above anything we were like back in 1999. So it does put pressure on the Fed to raise rates faster, and Wall Street not happy about that.
A fair point. It might not have been that great a day for the Fed. It just makes their hard job maybe even harder today. Thank you so much to Mike McKee reporting from Washington. And now for an economist point of view, we welcome Betsy Stevenson. She's University of Michigan professor of public policy and economics, and she's the former chief economist at the Department of Labor. So, Professor, thank you for being with us. Give us your take on these jobs numbers. Good news, bad news, in between?
I think it's great news, and even great news for the Fed, because what they want to see is that people are going back to work, that they're getting hired without too much wage pressure. I think if what we saw were fewer jobs being added, but wages increasing, we'd be a lot more worried because we wouldn't see the kind of expansion that we're hoping for. We do have a lot of people who have not gotten back to work. And, how many people that is sort of a tough question to answer, because what we saw prior to the pandemic was both among sort of what we call prime age, sort of at the peak of life, 25 to sort of 55-year-old-ish people participating in the labor force. For both men and women, that was trending up between 2015 and 2020. Would it have continued to trend up without the pandemic, or would it have leveled off? We don't really know the answer to that, but what we know is we're not even back to where we were from that labor force participation before the pandemic. So we've got a ways to go to get people back in the labor force. And if you look deeper into the numbers, what you see is we still have an elevated number of people who are not in the labor force who say they want a job right now, right? So we have roughly 1 million more people than in pre-pandemic times, good, strong pre-pandemic economic times, that are telling us that I'm not in the labor force right now, but I want a job. So as long as those people keep responding to those help wanted ads, we will see the economy continue to expand, getting people back into work without too much upward pressure on wages. I think the fear is wage pressure picks up and fewer people come back to work.
Okay, so Professor, I want to pick up on what you were talking about with participation, because Bloomberg spoke with Labor Secretary Marty Walsh earlier today, and he emphasized exactly what you're talking about, the people who still are not back to work. This is part of what he had to say.
When we think about moving forward into 2022, 1.6 million people still need to return back to the workforce. How do we get those folks back to work? How do we make sure that labor participation number goes up? Certainly, there's still jobs open in the United States. That's one of the things. I'm not taking away from the report. I'm very excited about the report. But I think we're thinking about here, how do we move forward?
So, Professor, answer his question, how do we move forward? And maybe more pointedly, is it possible to try to get more of those people back to work without even exacerbating what is already a profound inflation problem?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible to get them back to work without exacerbating an inflation problem. In fact, what we need to do is get them back to work in order to not exacerbate an inflation problem. Here's the way to think about it. Where have we not seen a lot of inflation? We haven't seen it in the service sector outside of housing. So things like medical services, leisure and hospitality, there haven't been big price increases. So what's going to happen is this summer, COVID is, hopefully a little bit in our rearview mirror. We decide we're going to go out to eat. We're going to go back and get that preventative health care that we need. We are going to go and travel. Well, they're going to have to hire people. Are they going to be able to hire people or not? If they can't hire people, then there won't be enough of those services. And that's going to push up the prices as we try to allocate too few services for the big spike in demand. So that's our real question is, as demand increases for these services, will we be able to hire the workers necessary to be able to provide those services without raising prices? If the answer is yes, we can get those workers, then we're not going to have that inflationary pressure. If the answer is no, and we get the demand, but we don't get the increased labor supply, then the answer is going to be yes. That's where we're going to see price increases.
So, Professor, let me focus on the unemployment rate for a moment. We're down to 3.6%, which, as I recall, is about 0.1% above where it was before the pandemic, when we thought we were pretty close to full employment. Where are we headed on unemployment? Because, in fact, by getting all these workers back to work, we're going to drive that number down further. Are we going to go below 3.5% to 3%, below 3%?
I really don't think that the unemployment rate is the key number right now. It's really the labor force participation rate. We need to get people to enter into the labor market who are not being counted as the unemployed right now because they're not actively looking for work. And so we need those people to start actively looking for work. There are jobs out there, and we need to bring more people in. We could see the unemployment rate go down a bit. The unemployment rate has always been in the low 2% for college graduates in a strong economic period. So now that we have a lot of demand for people without a college degree, we could see their unemployment rate go down as low as what we typically see for college graduates. So I'm not going to say you can't see it go down, but there is at some point a limit, because it just takes time between that moment at which somebody says, I'm going to look for a job, and that moment that they start working. And that gap is what we call unemployment. So I think the real thing to focus on right now is the employment rate, which is a function of labor force participation.
So Betsy, last question here. You say that this is not bad news for the Fed. It does not make their job harder. So give them a little free advice right now. What do they do given these numbers?
Well, I think we all know that the Fed needs to raise rates, but I think that they can be cheered by the fact that people are coming back to work. We've seen over 500,000 people a month re-entering the labor force, coming back in. We're seeing participation growing. We're seeing new jobs being added and workers coming to take them on. And I think as long as you see that, they don't have to slam on the brakes as hard as some people might have been thinking. So that's why I think this is a cheery report for them. It's when job growth slows and wage growth continues that we might need to slam the brakes.
Are you worried at all about demand destruction because of the inflation? We saw some numbers earlier this week that suggested that people are not buying as much, certainly in real dollars.
You know, in some sense, that's exactly what we need. We need to slow the economy a little bit, but not too much. And the question is, where do we slow it? Our demand for goods has been through the roof. And I'm just hoping people, they bought a lot of couches, they bought a lot of cars. It's okay if demand there slows down a little bit. I think the real question is going to be what happens when demand for services picks up, because the vast majority of workers in the economy work in the service industry. It's very sensitive to things like wages. And so I think that's where we really need to worry. But a slight slowdown in people purchasing goods is probably exactly what we need right now.
Okay, it's always great to have you on these subjects, Betsy. It's great to talk with you. That's Professor Betsy Stevenson of the University of Michigan. Coming up, President Biden suggests Vladimir Putin is distancing himself from some of his advisors. We talk with a Putin authority, Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Angela Stent is a true authority on Vladimir Putin. She wrote the book on it, literally. She is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and her book was called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. So thank you, Professor Stent, for being with us. As I just said to you, boy, you are in the center of it right now, because I don't go anywhere without seeing people are asking, what is Vladimir Putin thinking? What do you make of what's going on right now? Is Vladimir Putin losing this war the way a lot of people are saying at this moment?
Well, the Russian army is certainly not doing as well as they thought it would do. I wouldn't say the Russians are losing, but they're certainly not winning yet. So, we hear these rumors that he is being badly informed by those around him about what's going on. He doesn't really know fully what's going on, but he knows that the sanctions are hitting hard and they'll hit even harder. And there is some attempt for some negotiations. I think they're virtual at the moment. They met in person a couple of days ago. On the other hand, you hear completely contradictory signals from the Kremlin about whether any progress is being made in these negotiations. So one has to assume that he's sitting and stewing and thinking, how can they recoup this? How can they conduct a war which they can then say that they've won? And I think that's still a major challenge for them now.
You've studied President Putin for years, and so you have a sense of how he may have changed or how his organization may have changed. Is he more isolated and more insulated from honest advice than he was, say, 10 years ago?
Oh, I think people definitely believe that. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic has made that much worse. He's been for over 2 years sort of in a bubble, really quite isolated, apparently only meeting with 4 or 5 of his top aides who've been telling him what he wants to hear, maybe against their better judgment because they know what the real situation is on the ground. So he used to be someone who wasn't such a risk taker. If you look at the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, Russia went in, it recognized 2 entities there. It didn't go to the capital, Tbilisi. It didn't remove the president, Saakashvili. And even in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and began a war in the Donbass, it limited itself to what it was doing. And now he seems to have thrown caution to the wind and really thought that he could take over all of Ukraine in 72 hours. So there seems to be an element there where he's taking far more risks, and he's lost maybe that sense of proportion that he had before.
Given that situation, what do you think the best move for the West, for the United States and NATO allies, others, is right now? Should we be actually upping the armament that we're sending in, maybe sending in even heavier weapons? We had a retired general on yesterday said we should send in surface-to-surface missiles so they could strike inside Russia, the Ukrainians.
Well, we're doing what we should. We're already sending more arms to the allies, NATO allies on the front lines in Eastern Europe. So that, I think, is important. We're doubling down on the sanctions. And there is a debate going on about whether there should be more direct military assistance to the Ukrainians. We're not willing to have a no-fly corridor or even so far to supply them with Soviet-era fighter jets, because the concern is there could then somehow be a direct confrontation between US and Russian, or NATO and Russian troops, and who knows where that would lead. But I think, and we've just announced another huge aid package to Ukraine. So we're doing as much as we can do. The Biden administration having made the decision that it didn't want to risk any kind of direct involvement in this war.
There are, of course, discussions going on. Again, they were renewed virtual discussions today between the Ukrainians on the one hand and the Russians on the other. What do you think the path in negotiations is? Is there a potential diplomatic solution here that Vladimir Putin could accept?
Well, I think there is one. I mean, the Ukrainians are serious about negotiations. They've said they're willing to concede to the Russians that they'll declare neutrality. They won't try and join NATO, but they do want security guarantees from the outside world if they give up this. They've also said, let's talk about Crimea. Let's talk about the Donbass. Let's give, they've said 15 years to talk about the status of these regions, but we're willing to discuss it. So those are all demands that the Russians have made, and where the Ukrainians are willing to engage. The problem is, what is it the Russians are prepared to do? And of course, the demand is from Ukraine that the Russians have to withdraw all the troops to where they were before February 24th, when this war began. And so far, we haven't seen any sign from the Russians that they're willing to do that. But there is a deal that could be made. The question is, do the Russians want it? Is he ready to do it at the moment? He could present this as a victory, saying, Ukraine isn't going to join NATO, so we don't have to be so concerned anymore.
Yeah, and as you just suggested, it's not what the Russians want, it's what one person, Vladimir Putin, wants, from everything we can tell from the outside. You know a lot about this man, and I welcome your view on this very hot-button issue. The United States has said regime change is not U.S. policy. At the same time, can you see a path forward to peace, not just ceasefire, but peace in Ukraine with Vladimir Putin at the helm in Moscow?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I can see a path towards a ceasefire that might last for some time, Ukraine making concessions, Russia withdrawing its troops. But I think as long as Putin's in the Kremlin, I doubt that he's going to give up his dream, if you like, his wish, his determination to subjugate Ukraine, to have a Ukraine that is wholly subordinate to Russia. And I think as long as he's there, he's not going to give up, but there may be a pause.
And for the United States and United States allies, the flip side of that is, should we be learning from what happened in Georgia, what happened in Crimea, what happened in parts of the Donbass before, in terms of whatever resolution there is, not encouraging Vladimir Putin to do it yet again in some other area, Baltics area, or take over more Ukraine next time?
Yeah, I mean, after all of those previous conflicts, we sort of went back to business as usual. Not completely after 2014, because we had sanctions, but still, leaders met with Putin and things like that. So I think the lesson we have to draw is that we have to keep up the pressure and make sure that if Russia does agree to a ceasefire and to some kind of peace terms, that they stick to it, and that we don't have another incursion into Ukraine in the near future.
Okay, Angela, it's always so helpful to have you with us. That's Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution and, once again, author of Putin's War. Still to come, Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger on what we know about cyber threats from Russia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The war in Ukraine rages on.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin.
What is happening is a genocide of Ukrainians.
Putin must fail.
Turn to Bloomberg for up-to-the-minute reporting from around the world.
1.2 million people have crossed into Poland.
The Children's Hospital, the latest target. Putin has gone all in.
And analysis of what it all means to you.
The corporate exodus continues.
For every daughter the United States could lose, the European Union stands to lose 10.
Keep it tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're talking about those jobs numbers out in the United States for March all program long. So we want to turn now to the markets and figure out how they've reacted to jobs numbers. And for that, we have Abigail Doolittle. So was there much reaction from the markets?
Big reaction from the bond markets. You have yields absolutely spiking higher. Stocks earlier had been slightly higher, now down a little bit. That could have something to do with the massive rise in yields that back up pressuring stocks. Tech stocks in particular, Apple a big drag right now in the indexes, down more than 1%, in addition to rising rising yields. You also have JP Morgan taking them off of focus lists. They're potentially diversifying their suppliers. Some real strength for technology, on the other hand, is this is super interesting. China tech stocks, very, very strong. That Golden Dragon Index, Tech Index, China Tech Index, up 4.5%. And this, of course, is Beijing is saying they may finally allow U.S. companies or U.S. investors to audit those China tech
companies. To get access to the audit papers back in China, which they've been really resisting, which changes access to our capital markets.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it creates that transparency. I mean, last year when there was that crackdown from Beijing, a lot of folks were saying that these stocks were uninvestable. But this has been an issue going back, I believe, I remember it as early as 2015. So if they provide that transparency, it could mean a real flood of liquidity into China tech. If it happens. A lot of ifs here, but it is certainly a bright light, and you have these stocks reacting.
Potentially a really big development.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much to Abigail Dulo for the report on the markets. Meantime, we want to go to Cape Canaveral down in Florida, where SpaceX is getting ready for a launch of a Falcon 9 rocket just a few moments from right now, and we're delighted that we have with us Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. So Ed, set the scene for us here of this launch that we're about to see.
Yeah, this is the Transporter 4 mission, David. It's basically ride sharing for satellites, right? Where SpaceX for around $1.1 million, $0.1 million, by the way, because SpaceX recently raised prices due to inflation and supply chain. Well, let's listen in on the launch, and I'll tell you more about it just after.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mission and liftoff of Transporter 4. Pitching downrange. Stage 1, chamber pressure is nominal.
So that's a Falcon 9 booster, David, that's flown many times before. In fact, it was the Crew 1 and Crew 2 mission, the same booster that carried astronauts to the International Space Station. But what they're doing, and for our radio audience as well, this is a satellite mission, right, where SpaceX is carrying satellites from all kinds of public and private sector companies. It charges $1.1 million as a starting price. And as we're approaching the moment of maximum dynamic pressure or air resistance on the rocket as it passes through Earth's atmosphere, they basically take it up to a low Earth orbit in a sun-synchronous orbit and then deploy them. It's a service that SpaceX provides for all kinds of satellite makers, and it's really kind of relevant right now because historically, many of these satellite operators have relied on, you guessed it, David, Russia to get their product into orbit.
Well, I did want to come back to Soyuz in a moment, but I love the name of it, Small Sat Ride Share Program, where they have this bargain basement price of as low as $1.1 million per ride. So it's really like a condominium up there.
Yeah, it really is. And this is the bigger picture SpaceX story, that they've lowered the barrier to entry. And that has created a broader ecosystem of companies. I'm talking about literal startups, many of them in Silicon Valley, near to where I am now, who wouldn't be able to otherwise afford to get their little satellite. And some of them, they're like this big, right? And for our radio audience, the size of a shoebox, to get them into orbit because the cost of launch has been so prohibitively expensive in the past.
Well, let's come back to Russia for a second here. What is the effect of what we're seeing right now, not just the war in Ukraine, but also the aftermath of that because of the sanctions?
Yeah, it's twofold, David. The first, as I just said, that historically, the Soyuz launch system that Russia provides has carried satellites into orbit for many Western, American, European private sector companies. With sanctions, that's no longer an option. The second problem is that the Soyuz rocket engine is actually used by a number of US players. For example, Northrop use Russian-built RD-10 engines or RD-810 engines. The ULA, United Launch Alliance, have historically relied on Russian-built engines as well. Not necessarily tied to sanctions, but the Russians have basically turned around and said, we will no longer ship these engines. We won't give you access. That puts the focus on SpaceX, right? Because SpaceX launches more frequently than any other player. They launch more volume than any other player. So they're able to offer this as an alternative. And what you just saw on the screen, and for our radio audience, the first stage booster, the long rockety part, has just split from the second stage, which is what's actually carrying the payload, which is the satellites.
And then, as I understand it, we should see the booster come back down and land on the drone ship somewhere on the Atlantic. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So we're about 3 minutes into this mission, David. What has just happened is that the nose cone protecting the satellite, which is called the two fairing halves, they have just separated and released from the second stage. They'll fall back down to Earth and SpaceX will recover them. And then in about 5 minutes' time, the booster will initially through its own sort of own free fall back down to earth. It'll then orient itself and use those engines to give a final burst to slow itself down and land on a drone ship in the Atlantic. And just for fun, David, the drone ship's name is Just Read the Instructions.
I hope it's that simple. That'd be reassuring. So as we continue on our radio and our TV audiences to watch this launch, I want to raise one other thing with you, Ed, which is Amazon, because there was an election, a union election today that may have some consequences.
Yes. So this was a vote that seemed incredibly tight. The final outcome, as I look on my Bloomberg screen, 2,300 yes votes versus 1,855 no votes for Amazon. And as we build this in the Bloomberg story on the Bloomberg terminal and Bloomberg.com, it is a watershed moment for Amazon. Amazon has fulfillment and distribution centers all over the United States. It employs 1.6 million people globally, the majority of which are in the United States. And the consensus here is this was an unlikely union victory, right? Amazon has resisted unionization to this point. The question now is, do we see other cities, other states that have these fulfillment centers follow suit?
And if memory serves, Ed, there is another one, a substantial one down in Alabama that Amazon lost the first time around. The NLRB said, you got to go back and do it again because you played over the line, let me put it that way, to Amazon. So I wonder if this might have consequences for things like the Alabama election.
Yeah, and that Alabama election continues. The vote counting, as you said, was done for a second time. And Amazon has invested in, lobbyists, in consultants to kind of fight this. This movement. But as with the New York case, as we saw in the Alabama case, a recount, challenges, going to the ombudsman or taking grievances to arbitration are all possible outcomes. So it's a really big moment for the unionization movement, but there are probably going to be some twists and turns in this New York example.
Ed, bear with me here. I'm going to try to tie together a space launch with Amazon with the jobs numbers, because I wonder how much of what we're seeing with the Amazon votes and in unionization, organized labor, is tied into the fact that there is a shortage of workers. There's a big demand for a lot of jobs out there wanting, and maybe it's more likely that the unions will make progress in that world.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I was discussing with Guy Johnson last hour about how here in the United States, and much of our Bloomberg TV and radio audience will have seen this, Amazon is running television ads, right? Playing up the idea that they pay $15 per hour, minimum, and even higher in cities where the cost of living is higher, and give health benefits from day one. And you do wonder whether that is not just tied to the unionization effort that's currently underway, but for them to be competitive in what's a very tight jobs market. It's not a new story for Amazon. I would say, as somebody that covers the company from the corporate side, ever since the early days of the pandemic, Amazon has spent billions of dollars to ensure and grow that workforce. And as I said, headcount is now 1.6 million people globally. So, this is part and parcel of being competitive in a tough jobs environment. But Amazon has, based on past precedent, put their money where their mouth is.
Okay, Ed, thank you so very much. That's our colleague, Ed Ludlow, who covers space and Amazon. And we'll keep the images up of the launch of the SpaceX for our television audience as we come back down here to Earth and address the really important question of cybersecurity. The Biden administration has been warning us about cyber threats from Russia. And the ranking member of the House Homeland Security Committee, John Katko of New York, told us earlier this week that it is the greatest threat that we face today.
5 years ago, the biggest threat to our country was ISIS-inspired massive acts of violence here. That's no longer the case. The biggest threat to our country from a Homeland Security standpoint, and really national security, is cyber actors attacking us. And at Homeland Security, that's what we're doing 24/7.
And now we go to the White House and Ann Neuberger. She's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. So thank you so much for being with us. You are a true authority in this. I've read your resume. You've been dealing with this for quite some time. Give us a sense about the size and the scope of the cyber threat right now, particularly with respect to Russia, particularly in the wake of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, David. Great to be here with you today. So we've certainly seen Russia use cyber activity to destabilize and coerce. Certainly with regard to Ukraine. With regard to the United States, from day one, the administration has been creating a sense of urgency to really address our digital defenses and making significant progress with the private sector in doing so. Today, as we look at the threat, you heard us recently, the president issued a statement, and we talked about the evolving threat intelligence of Russia's intention to potentially conduct cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure. and how that is a call to action and a call to responsibility to do the things we can do to prevent them from being successful.
So there's the potential there, and I guess my question is, and of course not wanting you to reveal anything you wouldn't reveal because it says that there's national security involved, but still, do we have specific information about specific actions Russia's taken against federal programs or private programs in cyber since Ukraine?
There are no specific credible threats. What we're seeing is that evolving potential intention. So to ensure that the federal government and mostly companies, because companies operate critical infrastructure in the United States, are prepared and taking the steps needed to address it. We've been bringing companies in and briefing them by the thousands to sharing sensitive information, most importantly, providing tools and resources. But the key piece really is that particularly for securing critical infrastructure in the United States, companies need to act, use those resources that we provide, and take the steps to lock their digital doors to prevent successful cyber attacks.
So give us a sense. We heard from President Biden. He addressed a number of CEOs recently saying we really need your help on cybersecurity, and it's a patriotic duty. It's not just in your interest. Give us a sense of what specifically you're asking from U.S. corporations that they're not doing now.
Absolutely. Really two sets of things. The first is to deploy cybersecurity protections that make it far harder for even a sophisticated attacker to be successful. Things like multi-factor authentication. Passwords are dead. They're either too short or we reuse them so often that adversaries have collected them. So multi-factor is a second way of giving proof of a digital identity. Things like backing up data. So if a network is encrypted, companies have a backup. Mostly what we're calling on CEOs to do is bring together their leadership teams and make it a CEO level priority, both in the level of security on their networks and exercising, and frankly, both as well for technology companies to start baking in security in the way tech is built, rather than today what often occurs bolting it on or making it the responsibility of the user to configure technology correctly. So there's two calls to action there. There's a call to action, particularly to owners and operators of critical infrastructure in the private sector, to, as I said, roll out cybersecurity measures which truly do make a difference in defending networks. And there's a call to action to the technology sector to build in security into products, kind of like when we buy a car and we have the seatbelt and airbags built in from the outset.
Just to interrupt for a moment to explain to our television audience what they're watching is that's the landing of the booster on that drone ship. Just read the instructions, I'm told, is the name of the ship itself out in the Atlantic. That's as part of the SpaceX launch. So thank you for your patience there, Ann. Let me come back to you. What about coordination with Europe? We've seen a lot of coordination with NATO and others on sanctions coming out of Ukraine. What is the level of cooperation on cybersecurity?
It's incredibly close in a number of ways. First, of course, there's intelligence cooperation. Intelligence services sharing information about evolving threats, comparing notes, and building deeper insight based on that shared information. And then there's close cooperation on incident response, and certainly as well on technology standards, saying how do we bake in security because we're all using the same technology. Much as the crisis in Russia has really brought Europe and the U.S. closer, has really deepened the appreciation for the role NATO plays, certainly from a cyber perspective, we've seen the exact same thing, tighter and deeper cooperation, and a recognition that when we work together, whether it's improving the security of tech, or whether rapidly sharing information to prevent an incident or to help an ally recover from an incident, we'll be more successful.
And you have a lot of experience, as I say, in cybersecurity, in private sector as well as in the public sector. Are there specific sectors that you're concerned about in the private area? You have a lot of background, for example, in banking. Are we reasonably protected there? What about our power system? Where are the places that you're most concerned about?
You're asking a really good question. There are certain factors that are common across critical infrastructure, which is the services that are most likely to touch Americans' lives are those that a malicious actor may seek to compromise. So as such, looking at it from a national security perspective, the sectors we're most focused on are sectors like energy, banking, water, and communications. Certainly, what we've seen is that in various sectors, leaders have banded together to work together to address cross-sector risk. You talk about banking. In the banking sector, companies work closely together. They exercise together. They find cross-sector vulnerabilities. In fact, the Treasury Department has done a couple of tabletops with banks of large, medium, and small to ensure that we're both learning from the sector and sharing intelligence and advice with the sector. There's one key difference. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead.
I was just going to say there's one key difference across sectors, which is for some sectors, the U.S. government can mandate minimum cybersecurity measures. Pipelines are a great example. And for those, we've made really significant progress since the beginning of the administration, based on the president really pressing for improved digital resilience. For those sectors where we lack the ability to really mandate those minimum cybersecurity measures, we see there's been less progress. And that's one of the reasons we're doing these calls of responsibility to say, please step up, even in the absence of our ability to mandate that, and put in place those measures that can enable to essentially lock our digital doors and keep an adversary out.
And as you know, this was Jobs Day, we call it, the announcement of the jobs for the United States that were created in the month of March. And I wonder if there isn't a significant jobs issue involved in cybersecurity. There was a report just yesterday on the Bloomberg that I found remarkable, saying there's something like 1 million people working in cybersecurity across the United States. That sounds like a good number, but there are 600,000 cyber jobs that are open at the moment that they can't find people to fill. Is that basically right, and is that a problem?
You're very right that finding adequate individuals to work cyber-related jobs is a key issue. It's also just a really cool opportunity. Folks don't need a college degree to work in cyber. There are all kinds of government and private sector certification programs where you can prove hands-on skills. There are programs at community colleges, as well as higher-end programs at universities. So there's a tremendous opportunity for really cool jobs in cyber. I'll use this opportunity to call out to that. And for folks who, wherever they are, whether they're starting out and they just want to get certified as a network administrator, get certified as an incident responder, all the way through to taking a 2-year community college program where you might learn compliance or more about the legal aspects of cyber, all the way through to high-end things like vulnerability analysis. So it's a really cool sector with a lot of opportunity for folks from all different backgrounds to participate in.
So finally, Ann, this is Bloomberg, as you know, and we have a lot of Wall Street people who tune in. We also have a lot of corporate leadership. We heard from President Biden addressing CEOs in Washington a couple of weeks ago. What is the #1 message you would like corporate leadership to hear? Because I suspect a lot of corporate leadership has heard cybersecurity is pretty important. I suspect that they are investing in it. What is it they're not doing they still need to do?
Cybersecurity is about continuity of your business. We see limited, we've been talking about nation-state threats. Beyond nation-state threats, we see limited reporting of criminal activity and ransom payments. In 2021 alone in the United States, there were over $1 billion in ransom payments made to criminal actors. That is preventable by CEOs really bringing together their leadership teams and walking through the set of practices, kind of like the fact sheet that was released with the president's statement. That set of practices, deploying technology almost as an alarm system on their networks and working across their sectors. That's message #1. Message #2 is if as a company, you're an owner and operator of critical infrastructure in the United States, as the president said, Americans rely on you for the continuity of those services, clean water and power. We provide, the federal government provides resources and tools and sensitive information sharing, but the steps that need to be taken, only the private sector can truly take to put in place the protections that will make a key difference in preventing or minimizing the impact of a cyber attack. We look forward to partnering and we ask you to take those steps.
And in both the public and the private sector, we never have enough money. At the same time, is the primary problem here a matter of how much money we're investing or how we're investing it?
It's really a two-part. First, as you know, the Biden administration and the bipartisan infrastructure law makes real money available for investments, particularly at state and local levels, to address cybersecurity. So that's the first part. The second part really is using the power of our money to ensure that tech is built more securely. And you saw that as well in the president's executive order, where we said we'll use the billions of dollars in government procurement of tech to require that it be built securely, to require that it be baked in from the outset. So banding together to use the power of the money we're already spending to improve the security of tech will make a big difference.
Okay, Ann, I can't thank you enough for all your time today. Really appreciate it. That's Ann Neuberger. She's Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology at the White House. Coming up, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers on President Biden's plans to release millions of barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Earlier this week, President Biden announced that there would be a substantial release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, says it's a good idea, but he would do it in a slightly different way. I spoke with him earlier today.
I think the president should stop all talk of windfall profits taxes as the single most important thing he can do to incentivize oil companies. I think the use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a good idea, but I would favor doing it in a slightly different way. The government can lock in a profit. What the government should do is sell all this oil and should commit to a buyback of oil using the forward market at the substantial discount that's available. So the government can sell oil for above $100 and promise to buy that oil back for in the range of $90. And then a year from now, we'll have the same size Strategic Petroleum Reserve we had before, and we'll have $10 a barrel times, $10 a barrel times, say, 100 million barrels of oil, which is $1 billion. And I think more generally, we need to take a modern approach, a modern financial approach to these strategic reserves, in which we think about using the futures markets and locking in profits at the same time we're achieving stabilization.
Boy, that sure makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not an oil trader. That makes a lot of sense. At the same time, Larry, how do you fit this together with the climate agenda that President Biden came to office with? Do we just have to put that off to the side for the time being?
Well, that's why I think it's such an important idea, David, to commit also to buying back the oil. We're not trying to lower the price of oil. We're trying to smooth the price of oil with this policy. And so if we're adding supply now and we're adding demand a year from now, we're climate neutral, but we're positive for stability. That's why the swap idea, it seems to me, is so much more powerful.
That was Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary. You can watch the full interview tonight on Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up here, the European Union met with China over Ukraine today. Was there any progress made? We're going to cover that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The European Union had a virtual summit that has been long planned with China today. And by all accounts, they really focused on Ukraine and what China's position was, particularly with respect to Russia. I think it's fair to say there was a full and frank exchange of views from what I've heard. But we have somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do. That's Tom Orlik. He's the chief economist for Bloomberg Economics and author of Understanding China's Economic Indicators. Tom, thanks for being with us. What do you make of what came out of that summit today?
So I think both sides are treading something of a tightrope, David. On the European side, of course, they want the war to end, and they think that Beijing has influence with Moscow to make that happen. At the same time, as we've seen with Europe's failure to sanction Russian oil and gas so far, there's a limit to the economic pain Europe is willing to take in order to achieve its objectives in Ukraine. And taking an extreme step with China, like sanctioning China in an attempt to force them to put pressure on Moscow, well, that would mean pain for European consumers and businesses. It's probably not a step that Europe's willing to take. On Beijing's side, well, I don't think they're delighted with the war in Ukraine either. But don't forget that on February the 4th, just a few weeks before the invasion, Putin and Xi stood next to each other and declared an unending strategic partnership. So Beijing also is treading a tightrope. They don't want to back away too visibly from that partnership. They don't want to be seen as bowing to pressure from DC or Brussels, but neither do they want to be seen as aligning with Russia and raising the possibility of those punishing sanctions.
I wonder, Tom, if Europe is different from the one that the scheduled summit was set up with. In this sense, it has long been the case that Europe is in many ways 27 different countries with different interests. Ukraine seems to have brought them together, at least for the time being. I wonder if that changes the calculus for Beijing.
So I think Beijing, if we look at the last 15 years of relations between Europe and China, Beijing has got into the habit of not treating Europe very seriously, viewing them as a kind of a weak player in international relations, unable to come up with a coordinated position with individual member states, which are easily sort of picked off or bribed with offers of preferential trade and investment deals. But I think that view in Beijing may now start to change. We've had Europe putting a valuable investment deal with China on ice because of concern about China's human rights violations in Xinjiang. And now we've had Europe forming this very concerted position against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So my suspicion is that view in Beijing of Brussels as a weak player in international relations, maybe that's going to have to start changing.
Tom, talk about the money. If you just follow the money, where do Beijing's interests lie? I mean, what is their level of trade with Russia as opposed to Europe?
Yeah, so I think you put your finger on the key difficulty for Beijing here, David. Xi and Putin stood together and declared this unending strategic partnership. But then immediately after that, Russia invaded Ukraine and pitted itself against the united force of Europe and the United States. And who are the bigger, more important partners on trade, on investment, on technology transfer for China? Well, it's Europe and the United States. So that's the difficulty for Xi Jinping. He can't back away too quickly from that strategic partnership with Russia, but neither does he want to line up too aggressively in too high profile a way with Russia and risk alienating those key markets in Europe and America.
Tom, just one quick one here at the end. As far as we know, what is a win for Europe when it comes to Ukraine vis-a-vis China? Do they need just neutrality for China, or do they want them to actually come over to their side?
I think neutrality is what they're aiming for, David. A China which doesn't publicly support the war, and more importantly, a China which doesn't help Russia circumvent sanctions by providing them with backdoor access to military or financial support.
Tom, this has been so terribly helpful. Thank you for being with us. That's Tom Orlik, Chief Economist for Bloomberg Economics. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. And coming up, Balance of Power will continue for a second hour on Bloomberg Radio. Hope you join us there. And this is Bloomberg.